In August of 1977, on a quiet council estate in Enfield, North London, a single mother named Peggy Hodson was just trying to get her 4 kids to bed. It was a completely normal night, the kind you forget as soon as it's over except for what happened next. Her daughters, 11-year-old Janet and 13-year-old Margaret, started bickering over who got to sleep where. Peggy, exhausted, shouted upstairs for them to just stop messing around and go to sleep. And that's when the bed began to shake. I don't mean a little vibrate or a wobble. It lifted clean off the floor. Janet screamed that something was pulling her blanket right off of her. Peggy raced upstairs and stood frozen in the doorway, watching in absolute horror as a heavy wooden bed slid across the room entirely on its own. There were no wires, there were no tricks, there was absolutely no explanation. That was only the very beginning. Over the next few nights, the house descended into utter chaos. Furniture moved by itself. Heavy drawers flew open and slammed shut. Toys were thrown across rooms with incredible force. And then came the knocking. 3 sharp, distinct knocks. Always 3. They echoed from the walls, the floors, the ceilings. The sound followed the family wherever they went inside that house. Terrified, Peggy finally called the police. When the officers arrived, they were understandably skeptical until one of them watched a chair slide across the living room floor by itself. The officer later wrote in her official report that the movement was, quote, completely unexplainable, and that official police report still exists today. It didn't take long for the case to attract journalists and paranormal investigators, including 2 men named Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, both members of the prestigious Society for Psychical Research. Now, these weren't believers looking for ghosts. They were skeptics who believed in hoaxes. They arrived with cameras, tape recorders, and notebooks, fully expecting to expose a clever fraud. Instead, they documented something far, far worse. The activity seemed to center on young Janet. The unseen force was no longer just moving furniture. It was targeting her. She was thrown from her bed, lifted into the air, and dragged across the floor by an invisible hand. Multiple witnesses, including the investigators, watched her levitate, her body arching in an unnatural, painful-looking way, her arms stiff at her sides. And then she began to speak, but it wasn't her voice. Her little girl's voice dropped deep and ragged, a sound that seemed to physically tear its way out of her throat. It was the voice of an old man, a voice that identified itself. It said its name was Bill Wilkins. Through Janet, this voice claimed it had once lived in the house. It rasped, "I died in that chair." The investigators, still trying to find a rational explanation, went to check the public records. And what they found was chilling. A man named William Wilkins had indeed lived there, and he had died of a brain hemorrhage, right there in the living room, in the exact spot Janet had indicated. The entity, whatever it was, hated prayers. Whenever priests entered the house to try and bless it, the activity exploded. Furniture flew through the air. Crucifixes were ripped from the walls and bent into strange shapes. Janet was violently attacked. The voice would scream through her, "I don't like you here." It laughed when people cried. It mocked their fear. And it never ever stopped talking. One night, the investigators recorded over 200 distinct, separate voices coming through Janet. These weren't impressions or a child role-playing. These were voices speaking in languages she didn't know, whispering things she couldn't possibly have known. Some of the voices begged for help. Others made terrifying threats. One whispered so quietly it was almost missed, "We are many." The most disturbing moment came late one night, when Janet, her eyes rolled back in her head, her body shaking uncontrollably, sat bolt upright and said in her own calm voice, "I'm not talking anymore." Then her mouth opened wide, and the old man's voice said, "She's gone." For several minutes, Janet was completely unresponsive. She wasn't breathing. She made no movement. She just sat there, upright, like a doll that had been switched off. Then, just as suddenly, she collapsed. Doctors were brought in, and they found absolutely no medical explanation for what had happened. Over the years, skeptics have claimed that some of the events could have been faked by the children. But here's the problem with that theory. Not all of them could have been. Independent witnesses like builders, neighbors, and those police officers saw objects move when Janet wasn't even in the room. There are famous photographs that capture her mid-levitation, suspended in the air, and the audio tapes still exist. You can listen to them today and hear the voice struggle through her vocal cords, gasping for air as if the very act of speaking physically hurt it. One investigator later said, "Whatever was in that house did not want attention. It wanted control." The haunting lasted for over 2 years. 2 years of unrelenting terror. 2 years where the family barely slept. 2 years where something unseen, something malevolent, shared their home. And then, one day, it just stopped. There was no grand finale, no final battle between good and evil. There was just silence. The Hodgson family, traumatized, finally moved out. Janet grew up, and she has never once recanted her story. To this day, she maintains it was real, and it was angry. The house on Green Street still stands. People who live there now report nothing unusual, but some neighbors say the very air around the property feels heavy, like something is just waiting. Because here is the part that still keeps investigators awake at night. During one of the final recordings, the entity was asked why it stayed in the house for so long. It replied simply, "Because I can." Then it whispered something almost too quiet to hear, something that changes everything. And because there are others, this wasn't a demon summoned by a ritual. It wasn't an ancient curse on the land. It was something that found a crack in a family's grief, in a child's fear, and it just stepped right through. So tonight, when your house creaks in the dark, when you hear a sound, and can't find the source, when you feel like you're being watched for no reason at all, remember the Enfield Poltergeist. Remember that some doors don't need to be opened. They just need to be noticed. And once something notices you back, it may never leave. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more daily ghostly content. And if you have a ghost story you'd like to share, let me know in the comments. We might just turn it into our next video. Thanks for watching.